Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to The Black Tower Show. I'm your host, Nathan Ford. Jake Fox, we're here in BC Studios, broadcasting 1310 WRSB, 1590 WASB, Brockport, Canandaigua, Rochester, and Buffalo, upstate New York. And it dumped a whole bunch of snow this last weekend on us. You see everybody shoveling their cars out, getting ready. Cold, and not very much sun up here, Jake.
The temperature today, though, is actually tolerable. It's not that bad.
Yeah, it's not that bad, but the amount of snow and the grayness, and people say that can actually affect your mood.
Oh,
maybe that's something we can talk about.
It completely does.
Yeah. And it's an honor to have Jeffrey Kaye. We love his work. Go to firedoglake.com. Jeffrey Kaye, his articles are up there. He's doing great work. Jeffrey Kaye is a psychologist active in the anti-torture movement, works clinically with torture victims at Survivors International in San Francisco, California. Jeffrey Kaye, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yes, hi. Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Let's get into it. When people are thinking about torture, they're thinking a lot about physical torture, waterboarding, and the like. Also stress positions and these sort of things. I want to talk about psychological torture and these sort of interesting techniques that are being used, vile techniques. And not only that, but how these techniques are kind of ingrained in the CIA, in their method of operations, because I think it's important for people to know that it's part of the culture of the CIA. I think that's the point that I'm trying to get at. Jeffrey Kaye, can you tell us a little bit about the culture of the CIA and how they operate in this psychological torture?
Sure, yes. You put it very well. The use of psychological torture is part of the culture of the CIA all the way back to the very beginning. The historian Alfred McCoy has written extensively on this and did some of his own research showing meetings that were occurring back in the early 50s, picking up on research really that was happening even before that, either within the U.S. military or the CIA or its predecessor organizations working behind a military front in projects that were known today, even though we know very little still about them, such as Project Chatter, which was run through the Navy, or Operation Bluebird, which was a CIA operation to use, and this is where the psychological part comes in, to use and rely essentially on sensory deprivation techniques, the use of drugs, and isolation in their solitary confinement, to break down the will or the cognitive factors of psychology. If there are any psychologists out there listening, the cognitive aspects of the human will, and to bring people under their control and to exploit them for not just intelligence, which everyone at the time knew you could get best by just literally sitting down and talking to somebody, which is what most interrogators did and still do, actually. But to exploit them, to get them to have confessions, and use them in show trials, and finally, and very importantly, to use them as double agents. To turn, in other words, in the lingo that the CIA and other security and police agencies use, to turn these people to become their own agents.
Sure, that's a very important point to remember, that it's not about this kind of utilitarian idea of gaining information. It is about manipulating these people, breaking them down, and being able to use them in these different ways that they see fit. Now, that is a whole different ball game, and that is very, very wrong.
Yes. And, you know, one of the things that made a number of the interrogators, who, by the way, are just fine using these CIA-derived techniques of isolation, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and sensory deprivation, or sensory overload for that matter, on prisoners, and were shocked to see a CIA program that was using really primitive methods such as waterboarding and shutting people in a box, or beating them, using walling them and things like, physical abuse, because they knew that this didn't produce the effects they even wanted via the psychological techniques. So there's still a lot of question as to why the CIA turned to this. And in fact, at Fire Dog Lake, not too long ago, I did a report that looked at, I was doing a kind of a review of a book by a Georgetown researcher that identified Martin Seligman, who was the famous psychologist who had worked on learned helplessness, and how the members of the military SEER program, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, had utilized Seligman's theories to introduce a kind of torture program, which is what we know today with the waterboarding, to break down individuals. And again, this was a turn away from the kind of program the CIA had studied and put really millions, if not $1 billion of research into, to learn to break people down via their psychological methods. So to a certain extent, we, the public, are viewing from afar some kind of controversy going on within the intelligence and military national security agencies about how they do the abuse. But there's no question that both of them are abuse. It's my personal belief, but it's nothing more than a belief, I have no smoking gun, that the reason that the CIA turned towards their so-called enhanced interrogation waterboarding-oriented program was because they wanted to get data. They had medical people present. And Physicians for Human Rights put out a report on this a few years back, in which doctors were present during all of these enhanced interrogations to take medical measurements on the prisoners. And I believe that was the reason that they had that program. Essentially, it was an experimental program, so they could derive biological data from the torture that they would then use for their own nefarious purposes in future planning.
The
to develop
biological data that they received from those experiments.
Yes.
Nefarious. But how were they able to use that information? What were they doing with that biological information?
Well, they want, so for instance, there's a television show that's I've never watched, but I know it's out there, about a psychologist who's based on Paul Ekman out here in San Francisco, who studies micro-expressions. They're using the TIA is using this at airports. I believe there was an article on it in the New York Times also recently. To use micro-expressions to read people's minds, essentially, and to tell whether they're lying, right? There's a lot of research being done that the CIA and the FBI and others are interested in on deception. And they're looking for biological markers or behavioral correlates that can tell them if somebody is lying. Are you really a double agent or not? Well, let's see if we examine minutely every expression in your face, or if we measure the cortisol or stress levels that are taking place while we're talking to you, we will have some kind of definitive information about what your intentions are. They really want to control, they want to control human beings, and they want to know what they're all about. And they've never stopped seeking this out. That's what the psychological torture is about. It always has been. It's not just torture for torture's sake. These people have a program.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to The Black Tower Show. We have Jeffrey Kaye, psychologist active in the anti-torture movement. He works clinically with torture victims at Survivors International in San Francisco, California. These tactics that you're talking about, the psychological torture, are they tied to what the Nazis were practicing at that time? Are some of those tactics that they were using, were those adopted by the U.S. and used within the CIA for their own psychological torture practices?
Yes and no. The yes part is yes, they certainly did utilize some of the research that the Nazis were doing, and they even worked with some former Nazis in the degree to which the collaboration took place and everything that happened is still classified. So, for instance, revealing this here for the first time, I've been meaning to write on it. I had put out a few months back a Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA on the Nazi doctor Kurt Blome, B-L-O-M-E. He was one of the doctors who was tried at the famous Nuremberg medical trial of doctors, and he was one of the 7 of the doctors who were acquitted in that trial, controversially so. And in fact, as was later discovered, the records of his interrogation by American intelligence agencies was suppressed in the evidence. And there's a good reason to believe that Blome was protected by intelligence agencies. And in fact, they tried to bring him into the country under Operation Paperclip, but some State Department officials demurred because he was such a rabid Nazi. And so instead, they sent him to work at the main U.S. interrogation center in Europe post-World War II, Camp King at Oberrussel, where he became the head camp doctor. What he did there, we don't know. He disappears off the radar after he goes to work for the Americans at their main interrogation center. So I FOIA'd the CIA on this, and they gave me a Glomar response. In other words, for those who don't know, a Glomar response says the CIA will neither confirm nor deny the existence of any records. In other words, it's so highly secret that they can't even say they have it and won't give it. So that's how deeply buried the secrets are. Excuse me?
Yeah.
Yeah. It brings me to really think about what were the ends for the Jose Padilla case. I mean, they clearly, the means were to drive him insane. I mean, through sensory deprivation.
Yeah.
You know, he's walking around with the glasses on and the earmuffs on and all of that sort of thing, and he was kept in a sensory-deprived room. But, you know, with the widely available knowledge that this does drive people insane, I mean, we are sitting here talking about it on the radio. They clearly knew what they were doing in that case.
Oh,
they clearly drove him insane on purpose. What were the ends to those means?
Well, he was to be the dirty bomber. It's another case we still don't know everything about. He was presented to the United States and hyped by, at the time, by top officials in the Bush administration as evidence to scare all of us that following 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, that more horrific attacks were on the way. The one they scared the most, I think Condoleezza Rice said this, it was some kind of nuclear attack. And they didn't, you know, it was a little bit much even for the Bush officials to come up with the idea that there were suitcase atom bombs that were going to take out Manhattan. So instead, they, you know, talked about the much more plausible idea that some kind of a dirty atomic bomb or terrorist device could be sent off. In other words, a regular bomb of some sort, though laced with radioactive material that would spray throughout a large area and contaminate a major portion of a U.S. city. It was a very frightening thought. When I think of it, I get scared too. But so the person who was supposed to be doing this was Jose Padilla, who was a kind of a low-level hoodlum from his neighborhood, who's actually had cleaned himself up a bit and was trying to get over drugs and had gone to Afghanistan, got captured in the chaos after 9/11, along with another fellow who was implicated with him but later released, the famous guy who was tortured by having razor cuts to his penis in Morocco, Binyam Mohammed. Anyway, why did they torture him? Because they basically kind of just mentally broke him down so he could not be somebody to give evidence otherwise. He was exploited, in the terminology the intelligence agencies uses, to exploit people. He was exploited, and by the way, I with the help of Jason Leopold, secured an Inspector General report on the use of drugs on detainees that we wrote about last year and got an admission from the government that they had, in fact, there was suspicion that they, and Padilla's attorneys had charged, I believe, that he was given hallucinogenic drugs. Of course, he could have been hallucinating simply under sensory deprivation, for those who know the psychological literature. But they did admit that they gave Padilla injections of what they said was a vaccination, but they told Padilla, totally unethically, even if this is true on its face, that he was being given truth serum. So they were giving, we know that at least in the case of Padilla, God knows who else, but the U.S. government has admitted that they gave him injections of some drug and told him it was truth serum. So truth serum, of course, goes all the way back to the kind of things they were searching for, since you asked, way back in Dachau and other concentration camps where they were using, experimenting with mescaline and other drugs, scopolamine, etc., to control the minds or force people to say the quote truth. But in reality, what they were doing was to disorient them and break them down, to then be used for whatever purposes. And Padilla was a classic case of that, and a very sad case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you say that they destroyed his mind, essentially, so he couldn't tell the truth. Have you seen any other cases where they've done this to people? They've destroyed them so the truth couldn't come out.
Well, yeah, there's a number of cases. Most of the Guantanamo detainees, you could say that about. It's very difficult, and insofar as the truth does come out, it's still kept from the American people. A very good example would be the Australian detainee David Hicks, right?
Yes,
who was released. He wrote a book on his experiences at Guantanamo, and that book has not been released in the United States.
Huh.
You cannot buy it via Kindle. You can, even though it exists in Australia, and even in Australia, they tried to shut it down by seizing the assets of the book from David Hicks, and had a campaign about just what a terrible book it was, etc. Yeah, you can't. You can't. So the truth, it's very difficult to get, but some of the stronger people obviously existed, but we rarely hear reports, and I know I can't go into details, but I can tell you that the English-speaking detainees who were released, all of them had severe mental health problems, PTSD, coming out of Guantanamo. We still really just do not know, and many of them, which is what led to the drug report, which was a whitewash by the government, but many of them alleged, of course, that they, among other things, they had been drugged. And of course, many of them had been water tortured in various ways, not just waterboarding, beaten, subjected to severe isolation. Hicks and others have spoken, just how debilitating that is. So there are, in the government, there are cases going way back on this. For those who, since this is the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, for those who are interested, not long after, once the Warren Commission began working, a high-ranking Soviet intelligence officer by the name of Nosenko defected to the United States, and he brought with him Lee Harvey Oswald's, purportedly, his KGB file, and wanted to assure the Americans that Oswald, the USSR had nothing to do with Oswald and the assassination. Well, the CIA had a huge dispute, at least on the public record that we've seen, that's what's been declassified about it, and they put him into isolation for years and harsh interrogation, and held him essentially as a detainee, and there were even secret Office of Legal Counsel things. How can you hold someone like this, right? Isn't it unconstitutional for the CIA to seize and hold somebody? It was a real foretaste of what would happen later with the black sites that happened in the case of someone associated anyway with the controversies around the JFK assassination. So these kind of things have a long history, and to go back to, and my other research is that apparently some of it's not just the Nazis, but the United States government amnestied and took over the research data that had been done by Unit 731 in Japan. If people know what that is, that was a secret biological and chemical warfare research program by the Japanese. And one of the researches that they did that I've only recently discovered included research on the effects of hallucinogens on individuals and soporific producing drugs. And since we know the United States appropriated their work, we know that the intelligence agencies as well were involved in that. That it's possible, but again I can't document it, that not just from the Nazis, but some of that psychological torture information came via the Japanese as well. And then finally, some of it came just from studying, work they did, looking at, the history of such torture and abuse. A lot of the things the CIA does even today, waterboarding, for instance, was utilized by, has been documented, been used by a number of different people, and the same goes for stress positions. Torture has a very wide and long history around the world, going back decades, all the way to the Inquisition and before.
So it seems like what you're describing is through all these years of research and through, a lot of pressure from, special interests such as, people who make bombs, people like Booz Allen, who are also on the intelligence side of things, that we've created and perfected a terror factory, essentially. We destroy these people's minds until they can't tell the truth anymore, so the truth doesn't come out, so they remain scary. The FBI is entrapping young teenage Muslims to do
their bidding.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's an important point to remember, that when people talk about, the argument surrounding torture, whether it is a utilitarian argument that we need to torture people in order to get the information, which has been proven time and again. We've had generals on the show, we've had authors, academics discussing the very basic idea that to torture somebody is not a reliable way to get information. And then we have Jeffrey Kaye on the show, and we're discussing the fact that in reality what's happening is that it's no longer an argument for torturing people because we're getting the information that is going to save everybody. We're doing it to break them down psychologically so that they can be used as agents for their bidding. Exactly. It's a point that needs to be reiterated. If you're listening out there, remember that the CIA is engaged in this. The government is engaged in this. Your tax dollars are engaged in this, part of this system that is doing that. And we've talked about the false flag, the underwear bomber. How come nobody wanted to say anything when the underwear bomber on that Christmas day in 2009?
Well, Kurt Haskell kind of came out.
He was the one guy, and we had him on the show.
Yeah.
Right. We had him on the show, Kurt Haskell. But that's an important point to remember, is that we're not acting in any kind of ethical way anymore. And thank you, Jeffrey Kaye, for hammering that home. And it's not just the experimentation that's happening on, Guantanamo detainees, people who are supposed enemies of the United States. But I do want to talk. Can you talk a little bit briefly about your book review, Against Their Will, The Secret History of Medical Experimentation on Children in Cold War America? Is that tied in? Is there a tie-in there?
Yeah, there was, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Although, there's two strands there that are somewhat connected but different. One was, the history of experiments on prisoners in America and on children, on vulnerable populations, which is how it's termed by the ethicists. was something that there were a number of scandals and hearings done. In the past decades, it seems every decade there's a new one. The radiation experiment hearings, the recent discovery about the U.S. Experimenting on Guatemalan peasants, on syphilis and other things. The book Against Their Will, by Alan Hornblum talks about, and his co-authors, by the way, talk about the experiments done on children in so-called feeble-minded children, orphans, children in institutions, that was done from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and, giving them LSD, giving them electroshock, giving them, inoculating them with hepatitis, all sorts of terrible things, in the name, supposedly, of helping humanity. And in some cases, the doctors arrogantly believed that was really the case. In other words, and I will grant them that in some cases they were seeking unethically, some route to help discover new vaccines and everything, but these children were just helpless victims. In some cases, it's possible. With the children, I know there's a controversy out there about the use of children by the CIA and MK Ultra and something called Project Monarch and stuff, but I personally have not been able to document that. I've tried. People get very upset about it, but so far, anyway, I have not been able to document it. But there's more than enough documentation to show, as the book Against Their Will shows, that for money, which is another, we shouldn't forget, very important motivator out there, for profits and for money, the children were used to enhance the medical reputations and garner new drugs and medical procedures to be used, even though it meant that children would needlessly suffer or even die. So, it's a very gigantic problem, and it's like an octopus with many tentacles. And I do want to say one thing just on torture. To pass by this, it makes it a little bit different than what others have said in terms of, does torture produce information? Is there any empirical reason to use torture? And the truth is that torture can produce information. I've personally spoken to torture victims who have, in fact, although they felt horrifically terrible about it, had in fact coughed up information under torture. Mm-hmm. It's just not reliable, and the torturers know this, but often they feel desperate too, and they turn to torture, and sometimes they get evidence. The Gestapo did this, and sometimes they don't get the evidence. What happens, though, is the real question is, how do you know who you have has any information? If you torture somebody who does not have information, they're going to give you whatever you say, right? I'm going to tell you something to make it stop. I'm going to make a false confession. If you torture somebody who does have, the names of all the agents that you want or something like that, or whatever, the location of the ticking bomb, they may tell you that, or they may tell you a lie, or they may be extremely disciplined and not tell you anything. So it's a more complex story than just simply torture does not produce. Because I've made the point, even if Dick Cheney could come on your show and say, I'm going to, you guys, I'm going to declassify all the relevant documentation and show you the scientific evidence we have that 90% of the time, the kind of torture methods that I had the CIA do produced valid information, it would still be illegal, it would still be unethical, it would still be a monstrous crime. That's why the Convention Against Torture, the treaty that the U.S. and most other nations are a signatory to, says there is never any excuse for the use of torture. And that would include the controversy over whether or not torture has efficacy. That controversy is an example of the degradation of the discussion of torture in this country, that we're even having that discussion. Because it doesn't matter whether it's efficacious or not. But today, that's where we're at. But I wanted to make that point because it's just a finer point to make, and it's one. Certainly the professionals out there know because they've done it, and they know that sometimes it has produced results. And in the closed corridors of the CIA or the DIA or the who FBI for that matter, they know that it does sometimes, and they feel that if it's just about efficacy, they can make that argument to their bosses. And but the truth is that the efficacy is not that good, but there's some. But regardless of that, it still should not be done because it's inhumane, unethical, and society and societies around the planet decided.
I'm kind of thinking about if the CIA is using these methods to break down somebody psychologically, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Okay, we've had guests on the show that talk about the Sandy Hook shooting, for instance, or the Boston bombing, for instance, their connection to government organizations, the use of powerful psychotropic drugs to break down somebody, to make them kind of a mindless entity used for their bidding. That's been a common theme. Okay, well, if you're going to say that they have the capacity to do these things, not only do they, not even the question of if they're doing it, we know that they're doing it. It's been proven that they're doing it. How far down the rabbit hole do you want to go?
Are you asking, does the U.S. program assassins?
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. The Manchurian candidate scenario.
Sure, Sirhan, so to speak, right?
Sirhan, yeah, very good example. I thought about this a lot, both as a psychologist and also looking at all of these documents and the records. When I've spoken to my colleagues, people who are not, really involved in these controversies, just to get kind of a different, clear, untouched viewpoint. And in my opinion, it is a rare but likely scenario that a small subset of the population could be so influenced, right? Mm-hmm. And that I think they've spent a lot of time, the CIA, looking at how they can determine who those people are and just how far, say, down the rat hole they can send them in a reliable way. Remember, if you're in the CIA and you decide to program anybody, you have to be damn sure and reliable that they're going to follow through on the action. That's a lot of certainty to be involved with. And I'm not so sure. I don't believe they got to a point. I see nothing to indicate they got to a point where they can routinely send out programmed assassins to do things. Sure. On the other hand, have some, were some of these things related? It's certainly possible. But I don't think it happens on a routine basis. I just don't think it's not easy to control a human being. It's a lot easier to destroy them, sure, to break them down, than it is to make them, than it is to control them in terms of their activities. It's much more likely that they get people to do things by blackmail and fear. Mm. And the person is not like a robot, but they do their bidding because they feel frightened. Or they even, or you break them down and reprogram them in the sense of ideologically until the person starts to believe it anyway. Well, yeah, now I do believe the CIA is a force for good in the world because it certainly would be inadvantageous to me and maybe even dangerous to believe otherwise. If you think that way after a while, well, from my standpoint, much of the United States is kind of brainwashed. They think the United States is a force for good in the world, and they are faced over and over again.
Well, the principles are good. The principles of America are good, and I do believe the citizenry of America do believe in those principles. Unfortunately, the
And
people that
some
are
of
running
what
the country
America
just
has
simply,
done.
it's simply not there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm listening to you talk.
But what do you do about
Except for the torture part. America loves them some torture right now, don't they?
I'm saying that the principles are there.
Yeah.
The principles of democracy and, liberty and these sort of things, they are there. They are written right up there.
They're written there. And people say that they believe in it, but they...
Well, they don't know. They don't know fully. They don't understand, the whole capacity of it.
I think there's a large section of the American population that doesn't believe in democracy at all. I think there's a large percentage of Americans who really want a real mix of church and state. They want a real theocracy. Okay. I think there's a large group of people, who. And it's growing, who want, some sort of a series of anarchist collectives. I don't know. There's a lot of ideologies being sprouted up right now because our whole entire system and all of the pillars supporting it are crashing down on themselves. Our education system is crashing. There's no faith in the markets whatsoever. People believe that they're, crooked. Our legal system is completely crashing. I mean, you have that kid who got off of essentially, killing 4 people with a case of affluenza, being too affluent. We're looking at a situation where none of the systems that support a healthy, functioning society are operating at where they should be. In fact, they're operating at a very a dangerously low level, and because of that, I see a lot of people not kind of veering away from the spirit of what America wants to be, maybe, or should be, or dreamt of being.
Well, people have forgot the principles. They forgot why they are important and why they should embody them. You know how difficult it is to internalize and begin to embody and live out what liberty might mean, or what compassion might mean in a real sense. It's difficult and it's painful, and we've chosen just simply to not do it anymore. Okay? And if the CIA wants to break down people psychologically using these drugs, because there's this case right now, mefloquine, the anti-malaria drug, they're going after these people right now. They're pumping them full of these drugs. They veered from that. I don't know. I don't have the answers.
People are looking for answers. People are looking for answers to, these very problems. This is a result of us falling apart as a society. When you have an apathetic a society as apathetic as the American society, and these things are just completely, they're not even 10th in line in importance to the American people. People who are, quote, awake are going to search for answers. They are going to search for alternatives, and that's where we're heading. And Jeffrey Kaye is steering people in the right direction.
Thanks, Jeffrey Kaye. You're doing good
Sure.
work.
Well, thank you very much. So are you guys. You're out there every day, I guess, talking to people.
Yeah, trying to get the word out.
Very important.
About these things.
Yeah.
I mean, the conversation does tend to go towards, hey, why don't you wake up? There's these ideals of compassion and understanding and liberty and democracy. Why can't we begin to internalize these things and start to live out these things? But the people have to push back, Jake. We always can push back against the people that we hold accountable, which is our government. We can push back against these people. Don't you think, Jeffrey Kaye? That's what you're doing. You're pushing back.
Well, yes, I wouldn't do this if I didn't believe that pushback couldn't take place.
Right. And that's the point, is the pushback.
Well, this is becoming a worldwide theme. I mean, you're seeing it in the Ukraine, Thailand, all over the world. There was a what do you call it? Almost a revolution in Bahrain, but that was quickly stamped down by the government. But all over the world, you see protests in China. China spends more on domestic security than they do on their military budget. So, I mean, people are dealing with this sort of, let's try to keep it together. Everyone's trying to keep it together. And the people are awakening, and the internet and people disseminating information is what's happening. People are going online and seeing, I like this idea. You know, and why is this cop, why is this politician preventing me from living my life this way? You know, I see them doing it in America or Canada, but you know, why can't I live this way? And you know, this is the internet is essentially, you know, any authoritarian's nightmare. You know.
Yeah.
Of course, when I talk to people about torture, they're like, put a boot in his ass and send him, you know, there's this attitude of just put a boot in his ass and send him off. And that's what we have to deal with. Unfortunately, you see people that don't even understand the kind of very basic need for ethical and moral behavior. That is gone. Okay. Well, so, I mean, you know, I don't want to get too pessimistic. I don't want to go down this negative rabbit hole here. But people, if you're listening, Jeffrey Kaye, go to firedoglake.com, read his articles. Where else can people see your articles? Daily Costs? I
don't really write much at the Daily Costs anymore. They have just become unapologetic, unapologetic defenders of whatever the current administration is doing, and it's just it's hard to stomach being there. So I write at the Dissenter at Fire Dog Lake. There's a number of blogs there. Right. Jason Leopold's The Public Record. For some time, I was writing at truthout.org.
Nice.
So that's currently where I've been writing, although not at Truth Out at this time, but that's what I've been doing. You know, one thing that's I wanted to say about all of this is to show you, it's like, I think the key, if there were a core or key example of all this, it would be the propaganda put out in this country, which is the liberals, and that includes the liberal bloggers, including even, you know, Glenn Greenwald, put out to support the myth that the current Army field manual on interrogation is humane. And this was, of course, was the Obama administration had placed it in charge of, had said that it was to be the new, you know, interrogation Bible, if you will, for the CIA and everyone else. Mm-hmm. But the Army Field Manual on Interrogation, which has been recognized by pretty much every single human rights agency, from Open Society Foundations to Physicians for Human Rights to Center for Constitutional Rights to ACLU, Amnesty International, and most lately in a report by the Institute for the Professionalization of Medicine, which is an academic institute out of Columbia University, that the Army Field Manual practices abuse tantamount to torture because in its Appendix M, it allows for the use of isolation, sleep deprivation, some forms of sensory deprivation, and the manual itself pushes techniques of interrogation that include manipulation of phobias, fear, and the use of drugs. But nobody knows this, and I say nobody, some people obviously do, but almost nobody knows this because those who push progressive opinion and try and, you know, fight back against some of the worst things continue to go along with this myth promulgated by the Obama administration. And I'm not sure exactly why this continues to be ignored when the human rights agencies have pointed it out time and time again. And I've been pushing it, but I'm about the only person who writes about it. Yeah. Almost nobody else, and it's shocking to me because it is the keystone for torture abuse in this country today.
Amen.
Not the Q-Bark document from 1963, you know, not the enhanced interrogation program of the Bush administration from 10 years ago, but today. And in fact, I documented and went to DOD, and they admitted that they're doing these kind of interrogations today. But nobody wants to talk about it or write about it. I ask you, challenge you, and everyone listening, why is that?
Why
words. Is that?
You keep writing about it. You keep getting the word out about it. Because this stuff that is happening is wrong, and it needs to be shown the light of day. And people are starting to take notice. Don't lose faith. Jeffrey Kaye, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and we'd love to have you back on the show again.
Sure, I'd love to.
You take care now.